There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I've been gone for a long time, 3 months, while I've been moving out here to Asheville. You can see my new background picture of the Asheville skyline. With me tonight for my first show after my hiatus is Howie Hawkins, who is the former 2020 presidential candidate for the Green Party. How are you tonight, Howie?
I'm doing great. It's great to be on your first show back.
Well, I had you on last year when you were running for president, and we talked a good long time about you, your background, the Green Party, the platform when you were running on. But tonight we're going to be talking about H.R. 1, which is the For the People Act, which just recently passed the House of Representatives and is headed towards the Senate. And that act is called H.R. 1 and in the Senate S.R. 1 because of the importance to the Democratic Party in having this passed. Now, I listened to Ryan Grimm's podcast, Deconstructed, and he interviewed the author, John Sarbanes, the senator from Maryland. He interviewed John Schwartz, who's a reporter on money and politics, who's been focusing on this. He interviewed Jacob Hacker, who with Paul Pearson just wrote a book on this and how the Republicans have really cornered the market on trying to hack our democracy. And this bill, and I just want to tell the viewers that you and I are not against this bill. We just don't think it's everything that it's cracked up to be. So first, I'd like to, talk about some of the good things that are in it. Why don't you talk a little bit about what it does for, ending voter suppression, expanding voter registration, strengthening ethics rules, ending gerrymandering, before we talk about the public financing part of the campaign of the bill, which you take issue with.
Yeah, this is a 791-page bill that rolls in 60 separate pieces of legislation. So I can only hit on the highlights. It establishes automatic voter registration, early voting of at least 15 days. It makes it hard to purge voters from the rolls. It requires independent districting, so the Republicans can't gerrymander states. They control 30 state legislatures now. So they get, like in Wisconsin, they get like 40% of the vote and 60% of the seats. It requires presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns. It requires voter verified permanent paper ballots so the elections can be recounted and you don't have the possibility of malfeasance or mistakes and machines distorting the results. I mean, there are a lot of measures, good measures. There's disclosure requirements for make it harder for foreign money and dark money to influence elections. So there's a lot of good things. And I would say this has got to pass, or the Republicans, between voter suppression, gerrymandering, and the built-in advantages of the US Senate and the Electoral College, are going to rule from a minority position going forward. And Democrats are going to lose control of the Senate and the House in 2022, in all likelihood. So the Democrats, but this won't pass the Senate unless they get rid of the filibuster, at least for democracy reform legislation. And holding that up are Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. And so that's the drama right now. Will the Democrats, play hardball or basically hand power over to the Republican minority?
Well, we're going to talk about that, the filibuster, a little bit later in the show, because yes, that is the question. And we can see just what happened with the COVID relief bill and the parliamentarian and some of the ways that the Democrats are not playing hardball and letting Joe Manchin be the president. But I just want to elaborate a little bit, because Ryan Grimm did make a big point of talking about this, how Trump has rigged the census. And even if he didn't rig the census, it is looking like 9 states will lose a congressional district: Texas, Florida, Colorado, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon. And you know, all those states but Oregon are Republican. And that will, as you said, wipe out the party's majority. And then the state legislatures, even without what Trump did, they can gerrymander, even without the census rigging. And all they need to do is take 1 seat to get back the majority. And so the filibuster. Well, no, let's not talk about the filibuster. First, let's talk about the objections that you have to the public financing, because the public financing was something that, you know, Ryan and everybody is making a big deal about this. Now you just call it token, but first let's dispense with something that he tweeted yesterday. And I had to say, Ryan Grimm is a friend of mine. He was in my house. I did a book talk with him and interviewed him, but he is lying when he says the Green Party is opposed to public financing of campaigns. And he used Kristen Sinema, who was once a member of the Green Party, and what she did that was so despicable, you know, to be a knock on the Green Party. And I just thought that was, not only was that not true, it was a low blow. So will you just say once and for all, is the Green Party opposed to public financing of campaigns?
No, we want full public campaign financing, not partial funding with the matching funds program that leaves the private money dominant.
Yeah.
And on the minimum wage, look, Kirsten Sinema is a Democrat. If she was still a Green, she'd be for that minimum wage. So, you know, that was just a gratuitous cheap shot that wasn't even true from Ryan Grimm.
Yeah, let's talk about the public financing, because it, you know, they're making out like it's such a great thing because it's a 6-to-1 match, and they, you know, for small donors. In fact, John Sarbanes was talking about this, and John Schwartz used the expression, it let's see, it politicizes people, because yes, it's important to vote, but most people can't afford to give more than $25, and a congressional candidate is not going to go to somebody's house with a excuse me, a bunch of people only giving $25 when they can, you know, go to K Street. So the idea is that $25 was going to become $150 with a 6-to-1 match. And that's why, you know, congressional candidates were going to start doing fundraising from small donors. So why don't you talk a little bit about that match and what's the problem with it, why it's deceptive, and also specifically how it harms third parties?
Well, that's what got my attention, because it increases by 5 times the threshold in presidential elections, where there is now a matching funds program for the primaries, from $100,000, and that would be raising $5,000 in 20 states, to $500,000, raising $25,000 in 20 states. And as Richard Winger, who puts out Ballot Access News, put in the cover story of his February newsletter, that probably would have ruled out every third-party candidate since this post-Watergate public funding program was put in. So it's set up to benefit the major party candidates, not the, you know, smaller upstart parties like the Green Party. And the same applies for the congressional elections. $50,000 in qualified contributions is a lot to expect of a upstart third party. The major party candidates should be able to reach that. So you're adding public money without getting rid of the private money. So it's kind of a reform that doesn't reform. And then the 6-to-1 match sounds good until you think about it. Take the presidential election. Suppose a Green candidate does just get to $500,000 and gets a match that would go up to $3.5 million. Now compare that to a second-tier Democratic candidate in the recent primaries, like Marianne Williamson or Julian Castro, who both raised about $5 million in small contributions. They'd get $35 million. So the gap between the Green and those candidates would grow from $4.5 million to $31.5 million. So the 6-to-1 match really radically increases the disparities in public funding for different candidates. It doesn't level the playing field. And then while you got public funding, it eliminates the cap that now exists in the presidential public funding program. So if you accept primary matching funds as a presidential candidate, you can't spend more. This year it was $52 million total, your matching funds plus your private funds. The HR 1 just eliminates that cap. And there was also a program for presidential candidates that was equal grants for each of the major party candidates. It would have been $3 million this year. The major party candidates don't take it anymore because they can raise so much more from private sources. But that was an equal grant. And if you accept it, you don't spend private money. And all the presidential candidates from Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, up until 2008, McCain was the last one to take that grant. Obama didn't that year. And since then, because there's so much private money flowing into these presidential elections, they aren't using that program. But the point is, if you took that public money, you couldn't spend private money. Those caps are eliminated. So now you got a public funding program that just adds to all the private money that's swamping the system.
Right. Now, didn't you say that it also raised the thresholds by which a candidate could even qualify for this money, which would also eliminate third-party candidates?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about with the presidential qualification is up 5 times.
Yeah.
For Congress, you got to raise $50,000. Now, there's a clean money system in Arizona. And if you scale that up to the congressional level, the House seat in Arizona to a congressional level, it would be $5,000. That's more reasonable. This $50,000 really makes it only accessible, in most cases, the major party candidates for the congressional matching funds. So the thresholds are too high. It'll benefit the big party candidates, and I predict the Republicans will vote against this, and if it passes, they'll be happy to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting too, because Ryan made a point in his article about saying that this money also goes to Democrats who challenge incumbents. So sort of progressive Democrats who challenge corporate Democrats, and how the party was not really happy about that, but somehow it managed to stay in the bill. So saying that that was kind of a good thing. But
think of Shirley Chisholm. You know, I don't think she would have qualified. She ran as a presidential candidate, but even in her district, in I think it was Brooklyn, you know, I mean, we have to scale it back to, you know, the level of money in the late 60s and early 70s. But, you know, she comes from a community where there's not a lot of money, not a lot of history of contributing to political campaigns. She'd have a hell of a time meeting these thresholds.
yeah. So now talk a little bit about the history and why these reforms, you know, happened and why they were successful, and what were the major Supreme Court decisions that we really have to, that this bill does not address. I mean, you say basically that this is a token public financing put onto a lot of dark money, that it doesn't even do it. Well, first of all, before we talk about the history and what we really want to see, talk about the other things that the bill doesn't address, which are the super PACs and the victory funds.
Yeah, and the fact that the national party committees, and there are 3 of them, the National Committee, the House Campaign Committee, and the Senate Campaign Committee, are currently limited in the contribution they can give to presidential campaigns to $5,000. This bill allows them to give $100 million from each committee. So that's over $300 million from the national party as opposed to $15,000. And then that's where the big donors can make big contributions. This year, a big donor could give over $109,000 to each of those national committees. If they gave to all 3 in one of the parties, it's over $300,000. And then you got people like Jeff Bezos, which gives to both parties. He could give over $600,000 that would then be funneled into the presidential campaigns. So this opens the door to much, you know, a bigger role for big donors through the parties. And then the victory funds, this is a result of Citizens United in 2010, the McCutcheon decision in 2014, and a measure put in the omnibus spending bill in 2014 as well, that enables the presidential campaign committees, but also other federal election committees, to set up joint fundraising committees with the national party and state party committees. And that raises the level that an individual donor can give to what they call victory funds. So for example, in 2020, people could give as much as a little over $620,000 to the Biden Victory Fund. So Biden was having fundraisers where you couldn't even get in the door unless you were going to give at least $500,000. That HR 1 doesn't touch that. And then of course, independent expenditures, mostly done by super PACs, are not addressed by this bill either. And of course, that's the problem with the Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah.
That requires a constitutional amendment. There is legislation to have an amendment called the We the People Amendment, which would end the Supreme Court imposed doctrines that corporations, which are artificial, have the same constitutional rights as natural persons, and that money is speech instead of just property. And the We the People Amendment would change that and enable us to regulate campaign finance. That could have been put in HR 1, along with these other 60 pieces of legislation, but it wasn't.
Why do you think that is?
Because they know it's a,
Democrats don't want to turn off that spigot of money, right?
I think there are a lot that don't want it turned off. I think there's also a pragmatic consideration. Would that get through with all the people that are getting this big money, through the legislatures at this point? So they kept it out.
Yeah.
But that's how you address the super PAC money, the big independent expenditure money.
Right. Now, I remember about the Victory Fund. There was a big scandal with the Hillary Victory Fund because the state parties were raising a lot, or she was raising a lot of money for the state parties, and then they had to funnel it right back to her, leaving them poor. And I think The Intercept also wrote about that back in 2016. And I remember that my legislator, my congressman, who was Ted Lieu when I was living in Los Angeles, contributed money to Hillary's Victory Fund. And that money was coming from people like me who donated to him. And I didn't want my money going to Hillary Clinton, but I had no control over something like that. So it seems like there's a lot of money laundering. And I know with the state party, the California Democratic Party, there was a big scandal with oil money because we do have campaign finance limits. And so these Western States Petroleum Association and Chevron and Era Energy could only give a certain amount to the candidates, but they could give an unlimited amount to the California Democratic Party, who would then funnel it to these incumbents. And that's why we were never able to get a ban on fracking in California. So talk about what is being done in Maine, Connecticut, and Arizona as far as public financing.
Well, they have adopted a program that progressives used to push. It's called Clean Money, Clean Elections. And candidates that qualify for public funding by raising a reasonable number of small contributions, like in Arizona, you got to raise, I think like $105 contributions if you're a state house candidate, and then you're qualified. And that money you raise goes into the Clean Money Fund that the government gives. And then each candidate who qualifies gets an equal grant to run their race. And they don't run on any private money. So it's full public campaign financing rather than this partial public funding in the matching funds model. And so Arizona does that, Maine does it, Connecticut does it, although in Connecticut they have extra barriers for third parties to qualify. So it took us about a decade before a Green finally qualified in 2019. So that's a problem with the Connecticut bill. But that's called Clean Money, Clean Elections. That's what we used to fight for. And in fact, I was looking the other day, Senator Joe Biden co-sponsored a bill for clean money and clean elections in Congress with people like Paul Wellstone back in 1997. The bill didn't go anywhere, but that was what was on the table back then. And now we've retreated to this matching funds program, which when they set up the presidential public campaign financing, kind of made sense for the primaries. But once you get general election nominees, then they had the equal grants for the major party candidates. And minor party candidates, they got between 5 and 25% in the previous election, would get a prorated proportion of that grant. That makes a lot more sense than what we got now is adding matching funds on top of all the private funding, which is still unlimited.
Yeah, it's a very neoliberal concept to me. You know, it kind of goes along with the public-private partnerships. And I personally think that anything a public good or a public service like elections should be totally financed by the government. But what's interesting about this is it's not financed by the government. These matching funds are coming from a surcharge on settlements that for white collar crimes, such as the Purdue pharmaceutical case or the Facebook case. So they're basically, because obviously we can't do anything that's going to increase taxes, except for when we're paying for endless wars or bank bailouts or what have you. So this isn't even really public financing when you think about it.
Well, and if those surcharges on those fines don't raise enough money, there's a provision in the matching fund saying, if we don't have enough money, you won't get a 6-to-1 match. You'll get a prorated match based on how much money's in the fund. The Congressional Budget Office scored how much that surcharge would raise. In over 10 years, it would raise $3.5 billion. That is so small. We just had an election where 13.7 billion was spent on federal elections. And that was in 1 year. They're talking about 3.5 billion over 10 years. So you do the math and assume campaign costs don't rise over the next decade. So you basically be talking about 700 million in public funding based on the score from the CBO every 2-year cycle. That's only 5% of what we just spent in the last 2-year cycle.
Yeah.
So you get 5% of public funding is not going to change the real dynamic, which is all this private money.
Right.
So that's what I mean. It's a token program.
Right.
And if they don't have the money, you won't get it.
Well, it's a real heavy lift to have a constitutional amendment, I'll tell you that much. I mean, I've been studying this since Occupy, and there have been bills, and then there's Cenk Uygur, who wants it to have a constitutional convention, and his wolf pack is trying to get it passed by multiple states. If you have enough states, you can have it be emanated from the states, this constitutional convention. But then, of course, Common Cause has been fighting him on that because they think that that'll open the floodgates to all sorts of right-wing conservative constitutional amendments. But Cenk says, no, Common Cause ought to know that's not true. It's only based on what you get the signatures for. But anyway, there are so many procedural things, and this is such a wonkish issue that most of the public is not going to be following because they're very concerned about pocketbook issues and how they're going to pay for their health care. Are they going to get evicted? What's going to happen when the eviction ban ends? And the minimum wage. And that just, Biden just failed at that because he didn't instruct Kamala to overrule the parliamentarian, in my mind, showing that he's really not committed to the minimum wage as much as Bernie liked to say that he was. What was your take on the way that whole thing just went down?
Well, I think you just described what happened. Biden is a old-time centrist corporate Democrat. And so the minimum wage is not a priority for him. And if it becomes a problem to get the rest of the COVID bill passed, he wasn't going to fight for it. And so, the millions of people that are making poverty wages are just going to have to wait as far as he's concerned. So, yeah, that's a problem. Although I will say on the constitutional amendment, when an idea whose time has comes, it can move quick. The last amendment we passed was something that Madison proposed as part of the Bill of Rights, over 200 years ago. And it prevented Congress from raising its own salary during the current session of Congress. And in the 80s, Congress started doing that a lot, and people got angry. And suddenly, this thing had been sitting around for 200 years, started, passing all the state legislatures, and it got adopted because people, finally said it's been enough. And I think people know that the plutocrats are buying our elections, and they're upset about it. So if there's an amendment to stop that, that's really the message right there. I think it'll have a lot of support. So I think it's possible to mobilize around that because everybody understands if we let the super rich buy our elections, we're not going to get minimum wages. We're not going to get protection for rent and mortgages coming out of this coronavirus crisis. We're not going to get a job guarantee or a public employment program to get people back to work, or a Green New Deal, or Medicare for all, or student debt relief, for all these things that you do the polls, the majority of people want them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you think about the tactics? Because Cenk Uygur from TYT and David Sirota, who was Bernie's former speechwriter, both came out a day apart from each other, basically saying that the progressives in Congress should play hardball just like Joe Manchin is. They should say that they're not going to vote for the COVID relief bill unless the minimum wage gets put back in when it's time for, the bill to go to conference. And I don't think they're going to do that, because the thing about Manchin and Sinema is they're dinos. They act like Republicans, and we know Republicans don't want to pass anything for the people. They just want to obstruct. Whereas Democrats, or at least progressive Democrats, want to help people. So they couldn't rely on the fact that the press, the corporate media, would frame it properly. It would look to their constituents like they, the progressives, were voting against all this other relief that the bill provided. But what Sirota and Cenk said was there needs to be a countervailing force of power, because otherwise you cede to Joe Manchin every time. So what would you have done if you were in there, either in the House or the Senate? What would you have advised they do after Biden refused to make Kamala overrule the parliamentarian?
Well, I'd see how many, people I could bring with me to play hardball like that. And I think you're right. The progressives, they want those checks to go out. They want that aid to the cities and states. I mean, I got a dog in this fight. My pension will be restored because there's a pension reform bill in there that's been around for a long time. My pension was cut by $200 thanks to bipartisan action on that same omnibus spending bill in 2014 I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of benefits for a lot of people, and they need it now. So this may not be the time to throw down the gauntlet, and because people need the help right now. On the other hand, if I had a whole lot of people and not just the squad, 6 people now, maybe I would, play that hand and, force Pelosi to put it back in and force the senators and get Manchin and Sinema. That's the question. Would they then, once it comes out of conference, vote for it with the minimum wage in there?
Right, because then you could frame it like they are the ones who are killing it, right? But
Yeah.
again, if the corporate media would play ball, I don't know if they would. I just had a couple minutes left. I wanted to talk about Cuomo, because a lot of people don't know this, but you're based in New York. In fact, you even ran for governor of New York. When was that, in 2009?
2010, 2014, and 2018.
Oh, wow.
I've debated him on TV. I've run into him on the street. I have a lot of Cuomo stories to tell, but.
Well, why don't you tell some stories? Because what's funny is I did a show about him a year ago with Rob Galbraith, who's based in Buffalo, and it was called "Do Not Let the DNC Nominate Cuomo," because he was making all his press conferences during COVID, and everybody thought he was such a great hero. And I knew that he was bad. And so Rob, who's been tracking him for years, we just went through a litany of why he was so bad. But it's only now, first it was the nursing home scandal and that he tried to cover up. And now it's the sort of the Me Too scandal. And just today, the president of the Senate, who is president of the Senate or House, whatever your upper chamber or lower chamber, called for him to resign.
The leaders of both chambers did today.
Yeah. So a lot of people think he's not going to be able to survive this. At first, they were saying, people that follow him, like Ross Barkan, was saying, well, he's not going to resign, but he's certainly not going to run for a 4th term. How do you think this thing is going to play out? And share something with the viewers that they may not have known about him.
Well, I wrote a column back in the spring when he was riding high on cable TV, saying he was an authoritarian technocrat and be careful what you wish for, and gave some examples. I mean, what we saw with the nursing home scandal, we saw with the Moreland Commission into public corruption, where his own campaign manager is now in state prison for taking bribes. He tried to doctor a fracking study before we got the ban on fracking. I think because we got 5% of the vote in 2014 and he had to compete for our vote again. So that's his MO. And then, you know, what he did last year was triple the requirements for third parties to get on the ballot in New York. It's now harder in New York than just about any state in the country. We lost our ballot line in this election because we didn't get, you know, 3 times as many votes as we used to have to get. And now we got to get 3 times as many signatures in the 6-week window, which will be very difficult in 2022. So I laid all that out and said, you know, he's an authoritarian technocrat. Be careful what you wish for. Now, stories, you know, he debated me in 2010 and 2014 on TV. I ran into him in Central Park in 2018 outside a MSNBC thing where they sort of a corporate anti-poverty show with lots of entertainment people. And I got to speak. I was given 1 minute on a side thing, and he ended up with 5 minutes center stage. And I think we were just bait to get him there. But I ran into him and I said, Governor, I'm looking forward to our next debate. And suddenly he looked real concerned, his brow furrowed, and he said, what debate? Like his aides hadn't told him. And I said, we should have a series of debates. And then he realized I was talking about what we ought to do. And he said, what, are you going to organize them? And he turned on his heel and walked away. I said, yeah, if I have to. So we ended up getting the legal women voters to do a debate. Everybody was invited, but Cuomo didn't show. So anyway, that's kind of his sort of arrogance.
Yeah. And now all the stories are coming out about how authoritative and bullying he is, but everybody's been afraid of him up until this point, and now I guess they have the courage to speak. So
yeah, that's when I was running for governor, I would have state senators in both parties wish me luck, hoping I got a lot of votes and embarrassed him because they couldn't stand him.
Yeah.
You know, they wouldn't say that publicly, but they told me that privately when I run into them at different functions.
So how did you do, Howie? What was, in all those times, what was the biggest percentage you got?
Well, in 2014, we got 5% of the vote, which is more than any third party for governor got going back to the Liberty Party in 1840, except for some socialists in 1918, 1920, where they got the anti-war vote. They got 0.5% more than we did. And Cuomo wanted to run up the vote. He wanted to get ready to run for president, get more votes than his father, Mario Cuomo, ever got. And he got less, and we're sitting there with 5% of the vote. So he had to adapt. Instead of being the fiscal conservative, he became what he called the pragmatic progressive. And he adopted demands we'd been raising that he'd never supported, like the ban on fracking, like the $15 minimum wage, like the paid family leave. So, yeah, you don't have to win the office to make a difference. And that year, we made a difference.
So now, is your continued loyalty to the Green Party, despite the fact that you guys never seem to get more than 5% of the vote, is it just because you just have such an antipathy towards the Democratic Party and you really just want to get the issues out? Because it seems to me that you're eminently more qualified than someone like Cynthia Nixon, based on your history and your knowledge of all the issues and your platform. And yet she ran as a challenger to him as a Democrat and got way more than 5% of the vote. So would you ever consider running, I mean, especially now that he's going to probably be out, would you ever consider running as a Democrat again, or is that door closed forever?
I think it's closed with the Democrats in New York. I mean, they know me and what I really stand for. And the Democratic leadership, look, I want system change, not just a reform here and there.
Yeah.
And my antipathy to the Democratic Party goes back to when they denied the Freedom Democrats seats from Mississippi and sat the Dixiecrats in 1964. And then they escalated in Vietnam. And I got drafted for that stupid war. And I could go down the years and all the times that when I fought on an issue, on environmental issues, economic issues, social justice issues, the Democrats were on the other side of the barricades with the Republicans. So I think we need a third party. The problem is with plurality voting, the left votes for the center Democrats to stop the far right Republicans.
Yeah.
So I think the key for us now is to get ranked choice voting. And I've seen more movement on that in the last few years and currently than I've ever seen. So I think that's a reform we can advance on in this current period under Biden.
Great. Well, we have to leave it at that. And I'm going to close my show by previewing my next week's show. So I want to first say goodbye to you, Howie, and to thank you for being on my show tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, so next week I am going to be with Evan Greer, who is lead organizer for Fight for the Future. She has been on my show before. And we're going to be talking about some of the great work their organization is doing in the following areas. One, we have a new opportunity to get net neutrality back now that Trump is out of office. We want to talk about the bipartisan attacks on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And for people who don't know what that is, it provides immunity for website platforms from third-party content. And both sides are trying to hack away at this, which would just be disastrous for free speech and a plurality of voices. And the other thing they work on is facial recognition, which is gaining steam, especially during the pandemic. And finally, the Amazon workers organizing. And as people may have seen, 2 weeks ago, I covered a solidarity rally here in Mills River, North Carolina, for the Amazon workers who are voting. They're in the process of a 2-month vote in Bessemer, Alabama, as to whether they're going to have a union or not. And if they get that union, it is going to be really life-changing for Amazon and also for other unionization efforts in this country. Thank you for watching. Please share this show. I think I've lost a lot of my audience because I've been away for so long. Good night and keep fighting.